Okay, so if you're following along the directions literally, you saw that I just did this part and those little loops. And when I get ready to assemble those down here in this step here, I realize, oh, I really need to be back up here and have done this step first, because you can see the wheels already installed. And here they're showing how they make the wheels, including the little housings. So I'm going to back up to this step slightly.
And just out of curiosity, now following the directions, I'm looking at those kind of like those arrows, those thick arrows with the strokes through them right there. It seems to me that you're not supposed to start there, but is that incorrect or inaccurate in the design?
Well, what this is saying to us, this is one of those times where the instructions could be clearer into the sequence, and they're kind of jumbled up here. What they're saying is, we need this part right there, and in order to make that part there, you have to start here. You need this part, and this part, which makes that part.
Right.
And so, and you need this part down here. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to look at this whole center area as a whole, as one step, and then kind of engineer it back and forth for yourself. I can see that if I were to add these little rails on now, before I did all this other work, I have the risk, it'd probably be okay, but I have the risk that I'd probably bump them when I'm trying to fit these other bigger pieces on. Right. So for me, it makes more sense to go ahead, do this other work first, get these other bigger, larger pieces on, and then fit these smaller, more delicate pieces on as a final step. Right. So I'm going to back up slightly and do that. These are made, they're glued, they're sitting over there to the side, they're drying, they just get harder. That's okay for me. So I'm going to go ahead and make these little wheel mounts that we see right here using the A15, A14, and for the first time on this model, we're going to use just a slight bit of photo etch.
Okay.
We discussed it a little bit earlier. This particular sheet of photo etch comes with this kit, and there's just a few components here. It's very minimal, and all this is really going to be is just like a gasket or a ring that goes onto this part. But for whatever reason, they thought it was important to do it out of photo etch versus plastic, probably for size. So we'll talk about photo etch and application in just a second, but let me go ahead and get these parts, the A15 and A14, cut out for you. Okay, so I've got a little bit of work done on these little mount points here. I've got one that's completed, again, by taking the A15 and the A14 and gluing them together. So now we're going to work with photo etch. And this is that little bit of brass that we were talking about earlier. Stuff that's this thin can be taken away from the sprue, the gate, the attachment point, whatever you want to call it, just with your knife. Again, these are perfect carpet monster pieces, so you're going to want to put your finger across that so they don't fly away. The other thing you need to remember about photo etch is that it's not a plastic, so we can't use the same glue we've been gluing our plastics with for the photo etch. In this case, we're going to use super glue. And then the way that I apply these is that I will actually take a little tray or a lid and put a little dot there. I don't know if you can see it. A little dot right there. And we'll use this as our application point. I never pour from the bottle. I never apply from the bottle. It's just, even though I have a nice fine tip on it right now, this is a brand new bottle. I just cut off the tip. It's still very large, and over time this will get crusty and you want to cut it again to get stuff out of here. So it's just a bad idea to use it straight from the bottle. So always use an applicator, and to do that I always use a toothpick, and I'll just touch it in the toothpick and then touch the part, but we'll show that in a second here.
Right.
So to get the photo etch off, like I said, we'll just simply cut it with our knife, our hobby knife, and just right at the point, I put my finger across it so it doesn't fly away, press down, and it's done. This particular photo etch sheet has a backing piece of plastic on it which got stuck there, so there's our piece. We got a little bit of cleanup there where we started.
And how do you clean that up, with your knife again?
Yeah, I can probably clean it up with my knife, or it sands back as well. I know that little bit of a tab on that thing's not going to be that big of a deal. I'm not going to worry about that. And just barely touch that area in there. Again, it's super glue. A little bit goes a long ways. Very easily just drop that back in over that tab. And I can see that the glue's kind of squeezing around it slightly. And that one's done. And we'll do the same thing for the other side. Okay, so now we're ready to assemble these parts together. We've got these two extra pieces cleaned up here. So let's go ahead and start the assembly process right now. I'm going to start with something here Remember at the very beginning, a little while ago, a couple steps, we were kind of worried about this little edge here getting this glued down. And I said, well, it looks like it might support something, but I'm not sure, but I got to make sure this works. Well, now I can see that it does in fact support this piece right there. So I'm just going to put a little glue along this edge here. A little more liberal with the glue this time. It's a larger piece. So you can see here what I've tried to do is make sure that I've got a good amount of glue underneath here, so this backside of this attachment point is very well covered and secure. I'm going to point out something a little bit interesting on this. Again, can't just look at the pictures, you actually have to read the words from time to time. You see here it says no cement on this place and up here. And what it's saying is they want your wheel to be able to spin. In order to do that, you can't glue it together up here. What we are going to do is glue these points onto the frame itself down here at the bottom, and then we're just going to kind of put this wheel in between these, and it's going to spin freely on these 2 points right there. If we were to put cement there, of course it won't be able to spin, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but it makes it a little more difficult to paint later on. It may be a little tougher to put the tracks on later on as well. Plus it's a nice feature, so we're going to go ahead and try to do that. So we'll just go ahead and take our glue. Okay, so the last piece according to the instructions is this little arm here. And again, this is a little bit of a tricky thing, and again we want to follow the arrows. It's saying that there's some tabs that go onto the top up here, but then we've got this little neat little curved arrow here which says we're going to go over the top of here but under this piece here. So we're going to go along the top here and attach it underneath this here. So once again we're going to kind of look at our picture to see if we got the right orientation. We've got our 2 tabs right here. They're going to fit into these 2 holes right there. And then looks like we got a tab on the bottom here, which we're going to hit with that tab right there. So now this step is finished, and we're ready to put those little delicate pieces onto the side over here, including these wheels. Okay, so we're back. We've got our little A8 piece right there that we've cleaned up, and this is a very nice piece. Actually springs. In injection molding or resin cast molding, everything that is made with a mold has 2 halves, a top and a half and a bottom half, which leaves everything with a seam line. A rounded part like a spring will have a seam someplace. You can barely see it right through here. And they're generally kind of tough to clean up because they go in and out of the spring. But this one here was very nice, and I was able just to kind of take my blade across it and knock off all that spring, the seam line. I can see from the photograph that you can see on the top of this the picture here, the part has a bit of a slope here, and I didn't know exactly which way that goes, but I can see from the picture here it orients to the left over here to my side, so I'm going to attach it this way. So I've got a little bit of glue I'm going to put down in this hole here, and I'm just going to drop that in there just like that, so it looks similar to that. And then I've got my pre-made wheels that I did before. And one thing I remember from before when I assembled them, and I'm looking at it now, I can tell from the photograph, is these are actually 2 different supports on this one. This one here has these little bumps right here, these little rivets, and this one here does not. And I looked at mine here, and this one has the rivets, and this one here has not. So I want to make sure I put those in the right orientation too. Probably wouldn't matter to the assembly, but just for accuracy's sake. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue into those holes. I'm just going to do them all at the same time because I'm going to be quick enough at this. And there we go. So now I got these little delicate parts that I made earlier with the little loops on them. I'm going to go ahead and assemble those now. And you can see this is the one that goes here, and I can tell that although we assembled it right side up to get the loops on here, they actually get stuck on there with the loops on the down side. And I can look on the side here and I see two tabs. It's a delicate piece, and even though we were being careful, we've got a pretty nice little warp in this thing.
Right.
So we're going to have to, when we put it onto the part here itself, we're going to want to make sure that we're mindful of that and get that straightened back out with the glue. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this part itself right now. Can't get my fingers in there, so I'm going to try to do it with this. we actually have a couple things working with us here. Against us, I should say.
Against us, okay.
These loops, now that I see what we're doing here, these loops, excuse me, fit around these little
so
parts
there
here.
is something that goes through them, right?
Yeah, so these loops have to line up perfectly where these are. So, you know, at this point, we're hoping that I did that correctly. Because if they don't, whoops, knock that piece off. That's okay. We knock pieces off all the time. Just glue them back on. But I need to get these to seat in here. Okay, that one's in. That's the easy one. So I'm going to go ahead and tack that in here a little bit better right now because I've got this in that slot there. And I can see that this is going to be a little bit of a fight. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I've got that front corner locked down. And then I'm going to I'm looking at this, and I can see that this one's pretty lined up, that one's pretty lined up, and they look pretty lined up all the way through. So I think what we're fighting is that bit of a warp that we were looking at before. I know I have another tab back here, so if I can get that second tab in here, then we've got half the battle. So I'm going to just gently coax it into place. There you go. A little bit of downward pressure, and that second tab is now just seated into there. What I can see is that it's popping these out. I can see that my pressure, these are not quite perfectly lined up, are popping these rings out a little bit. So once I get this rail into place and straightened out, I'm going to come back in because you can see these are still soft enough.
That you can, okay.
I'm going to readjust these back over the top of where they belong, just like that. I'm just going to push them back down and maybe touch them with a little bit more glue.
Right. But first you're going to get that rail in place.
I'm going to get the rail in place first and straighten this out because that seems to be part of the problem. You know, obviously this rear one here has got a bit of a problem. So what I'm just going to do is, with the back on or side of my blade, is I'm just going to kind of see if I can get this to kind of coax itself down in there. And it did.
But it broke.
But it came unglued. Not the end of the world. So what I can... Let's see what I got to do here. So rather than panic, the best thing to do is just make sure you just kind of keep your wits about you. And let's just see what it is that we need to do here and how big of a problem it is. And I can tell you that I don't think that this thing's actually going to fit in here very well.
Right.
It's kind of like that. So you can see that we've actually unglued it from the top plate where it was originally glued. And that's probably as much a function of that warping as anything else. But what we're going to do, because it's fairly insignificant, we're going to just go ahead and glue this
to that
to the point itself. We're just going to let that gap kind of hang there for a while, and we're going to see what that develops into. This next one here, kind of the same thing. Press it back in there. I'm going to go ahead and hit the top part here with some glue, though.
Right. It almost would have been better to put those
on afterwards.
Right on those, yeah, afterwards.
Yeah, the loops, I think, if you were to do this again, just do the loops later.
Yeah. You can see how much better it does look when they are all lined up.
What's interesting, too, this is that glue that we spilled way at the very beginning. You can still see it trailing through here.
Yeah.
So, you know, like I said, try to take care of every detail along the way, make them as good as you can, because the mistakes do add up just as well as your, doing a good job adds up. So we want to try to do the best we can all the time through.
Okay.
So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to refer back to our instructions here real quickly. I'm going to slide those in front of you here. Is we've got these springs on the back with the idler wheels. And we're going to move this around to the orientation similar to what we have on the page there. And I can see that this needs to go, I've already cut this out and cleaned it up, needs to go just in this position right here. I'm going to dry fit this now because I'm not real sure how it fits in there. I see some tabs, but I want to make sure. And I'm guessing it goes into something similar to that. So I'm going to go ahead, I've got really good access to these points here, so I'm just going to go ahead and drop the glue in these corners here and make my dry fit my permanent fit. So where that tab went down there, and then this assembly is basically done. You see a little bit of a seam line across here. I'm going to take a few minutes with that, and that's just going to be with a scrape with my blade. Hit those high points. It's not a bad seam. Just knocking off the high points. That will be fine. Okay, so we've got our little assembly down here that we've been working on pretty much finished now. We've got our springs on, we've got all the rollers on, we've got the little loops fixed along the bottom edge there. Move on to the final step of our assembly here. And what we've got on there are these basically little shields here that go on either side of this thing that basically deflect mud when the tracks are moving around. It takes the mud and scrapes them, deflects it off to the side so it doesn't accumulate in this area right here. The kit comes with parts to do this, and it's actually an optional part. If you look at the reference photographs, some of them have them on, some of them don't. So this is where the modeler, you have a choice of kind of which way you want to go with this. The kit does provide parts for this, which would simply, you can see how they just kind of tuck up into here and install as such.
Right.
One of the things, we talked about this earlier in our introduction, is that we had that LZ models conversion for the engine, and within that packet, the manufacturer added a couple of extra little goodies in there that are optional items that can be used to replace certain parts of the kit. One of those being those particular shields, and these are again made out of the photo etch, the thin sheets of brass. So the first question is, why on earth would you want to go use one of these versus one of these,
right,
what came with the part? There's a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason you'd want to do it or consider doing it in this case is simply because of the scale thickness of these particular parts. You can see here on the profile that this is a fairly thick piece of metal at 1/35 scale. This looks like steel plate, which when in fact this particular part was made out of basically just sheet metal. So it's too thick to be a real true representation of that particular part. When you're making a model, you have to decide, does that matter to you or not? It's really your choice. And you can see by the profile,
that's much thinner.
Much thinner. Let's see if we can do this side by side.
Right. Yeah.
Much thinner. So that would be a good choice if you especially want to try to make your models as detailed as possible, to keep those things in consideration. So let's go ahead real quick, we'll cut this out and we'll just see what it looks like on there. There might be another step involved here, we'll see if we get to that. Now, if we were to compare this now with the kit part, a couple things come to note is that this kit part has a little bit of a bend on that bottom edge there.
Right.
Honestly, I don't know which is more accurate, whether the photo etch, a straight piece was more accurate, or this particular kit part was more accurate. But we'll go ahead and put this up here just so we can see what the difference in look is.
It does look nice with the bend.
It does look nice with the bend.
Oh, the other thing I noticed, actually Rick corrected for me, I thought those were actually holes in the photo etch there. Those little, yeah, they're actually raised edges. Depending on the reflection of the lamps, sometimes they go dark and they look like holes, but they're actually raised edges. They actually do have rivets. But you can see that the rivets on the plastic part are much more raised off the surface.
Right.
Now, do you like that? The miniature guys would love stuff that's raised off the ground. Mm-hmm. They go to work on those things.
Honestly, in this particular case, except for the scale thickness, I like the kit part better. I like that little bend on it. I think that raised detail is something nice that adds interest. You know, as a modeler, especially when you get to the finishing stages, and your miniature guys are the same way, you're always looking for visual interest. What's going to be something that I can kind of latch onto, you know, give it a little bit of, you know, the interesting focal point, you know, weathering around that streak mark of dirt or rust or something that washes down from it or something like that. So those raised details do provide that little bit of an extra platform to do that kind of work. The scale thickness part of it, of course, I like the photo etch better for that particular reason. In this application, I don't know if it matters. I don't know if you can see it, that piece well enough to make a difference that you would choose one or the other.
Right, so it comes down to basically, do you like the bend and the rivets more than the thickness of the metal?
Right, and we can put a bend into this piece of metal too. That's totally easy to do, and maybe that's something we should just describe real quick.
Yeah, well, why don't we show how to bend that little piece of metal, and then we can still decide whether or not we're going to keep the kit piece or the... Okay, so let's take a look.
This little tool, it's called an etch mate, and there's a whole series of them. Different companies make them. They come in different sizes and such.
And these are used specifically for photo etch?
These are specifically used for photo etch or bending things. It's basically a holding tool. And they come in super handy because photo etch is very difficult to hold on to. You want to make sure your creases are nice and sharp and straight. So this is the perfect tool for it. It's aluminum, and this is a hard plastic here. It's adjustable. Matter of fact, most often it'll be switched around like this because I'll be bending parts around these little teeth, to fold up or around or something like that. In this case, because I want to do a longer bend, I'm going to flip this around so I have a longer surface on this edge here to work with. And so that it's very versatile. So, to get started, what I'm going to do, I'm a little bit short on tools here, I apologize. Usually I would use a straight edge razor blade to do some folding here, but we're going to improvise a little bit. So what I'm going to do is slide this under here, along the edge, get it all the way down there, and I'm going to maintain that about 1/16 inch straight line there to represent that fold. As a matter of fact, I'm going to pull it out just a little bit more. I'm going to reposition this. Something about like that. Now it looks pretty straight in my eye. Maybe a little bit like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and pinch it down. And so now that piece of brass is being held basically in this position underneath there. But I want to get this bend here. Traditionally what I would do is I would put the brass in this way, take a straight edge and bent up along this bar right here.
Right.
But since I don't have that opportunity because I don't have a straight edge with me right now, I've put it in this way, and I'm going to use actually the table to bend it down. So
right.
It's being held in position, and I'm just going to rock this across that area there, and it's going to give me a bend. And as you can see, I've got a bend right along that corner there.
Right on.
So,
who makes this particular? Do a lot of manufacturers make these kind of things? Or?
I'll give you a plug. The Small Shop, they're out of Washington in the United States. These are the best in my opinion. I've got a whole series of them. They're durable, they're strong, they last forever. They're not cheap. A little unit like this is probably $75 to $100 US.
Wow. Look at that.
But if you're going to do photo etch, it's one of those things you're just going to have to kind of bite the bullet and decide to get it. Now we've got that piece with the bevel in it,
right.
Very similar to what the kit part was. Now that we have the bevel in it, I like it more than the kit part.
Right.
So now I've got my scale thickness. Maybe my detail on my rivets aren't quite as pronounced as some would like, but I think I would go for something like this in the long run. Okay, so we've went ahead and I've cleaned up the photo etch and I've installed it here. It's got that slight bend on the bottom now. There's also a reverse side that I've attached to this one too, just another piece of photo etch. Because what we're going to do next is move over to that LZ model's resin conversion of the engine and the radiator, and we're going to spend some time building that up, and that's going to take a little bit of switching gears in our mindset here because we're going to go from plastic to resin. We're going to use different glues. The parts are a little different to clean up. And so this is a good time just to kind of make that adjustment. Plus, once I have the engine finished up, I can use this part as my sizing guide to make sure everything's right. The dress drops in here like it's supposed to. If you remember from the introduction, we talked about purchasing an aftermarket engine from LZ Models, and that's made out of resin, and which is what we've got started here. Although it looks like a lot of it's been completed, it's maybe about 50% done, just for the expediency of time. But for the rest of the process, you'll follow along with me, and we'll go through the techniques that we'll use to clean up resin, glue resin, make fixes to resin if need be, and talk about the various other things about resin. So one of the things we've been doing here is I had to build this part of the assembly from the kit first, along with part of the engine, in order to make sure the two are going to match each other and seat the engine within the kit part. And as you can see, the fit is very good. So only little minor adjustments later on will be necessary. And that's the remainder of the engine parts that we have coming along here. There's quite a few parts all buried inside of here, which we'll get into. Out of that mess, I've chosen these three small pieces right here. And these will be the first three pieces that we'll start working on to get ready and install on the engine. If we remember our little conversation from before, what I do is I use cyanoacrylate or super glue, and I like the slow curing gap filling style. It says it's 5 to 15 seconds. I think it's a little longer than that. But what I do use is, we call it Zip Kicker, but it's an accelerator. And you can purchase this from hobby stores. They have some. A lot of times it comes in an aerosol spray can, which is probably the least preferred method of application because you basically spray your entire model with this stuff. It's also available in little jars, and what we do is empty the jars into a little squeezable bottle with a needle on the top, a real fine applicator needle, and we're able to put the accelerator exactly to the point where we want to speed up our process of gluing. Yeah. This stuff is nearly instantaneous, so once you have your part fit exactly how you want it, you just give a little drop of that next to it, and it's set, and you're ready to move on to the next step.
So what is that, a paper clip in there? Or is
it's actually a hypodermic needle.
Oh, really?
So yeah, we use hypodermic needles.
We've used this type of material before in some other past tutorials, and actually Bob Smith Industries actually makes the accelerator that we used in the past. Mm-hmm. But again, yeah, it was the pump action spray, which just kind of shoots the stuff everywhere. I actually really like the idea that you have a very, very fine control of this stuff. It's really, really nice.
So here's our little part right here, and what you'll notice on the part is it's going to sit basically like this. It's got a little bit of a locator pin right there at the end, which corresponds to a little divot on the back side of this part right up here. So we're going to carefully try to squeeze that in there. And then, just as a final little precaution, I'm going to get it just a little bit of zip in there.
Right.
And now, that's hard as a rock. And we're ready to go. It's just that quickly. Our two more pieces. Got I guess an air filter and some connecting hoses here. So as you can see, there's a lot of flash. This is the flash right through here, what we call the flash. And these are a little bit about resin casting. When you cast in resin, it will sit like this when it's poured. So the material goes this way, and this gate right through here allows the bubbles from the resin to escape out as it's curing. Mm-hmm. It's a necessary part of casting, but all casting has this type of a membrane in here someplace. So those two pieces look ready to go. So we'll glue those and I'll come right back.
Okay, there you go. We can see that we've gone ahead and glued that piece on there. Okay,
so we're going to get started on a little bit of wiring. We've got wiring that has to go to the plugs and things on this side here. What we've got, and this was provided with the kit, but any sort of soft wiring would work. And this is a little delicate work, and this is going to take a little bit of time, but basically all we're going to do is affix the wires to the top underneath here using super glue and cut them to a certain length that we know will reach each of these points right here. Mm-hmm. And then once we've got them affixed here, we'll run our wires down, try to keep them together like they look in real life, and then affix them to the tops up here. So at this point, all I've done is put some glue on the wire, stuck it under there, and hit it with a little bit of that accelerator to get it to stick in place. And I'll give it just a little bit of a tug to see if it's there, and it is. So I'm just going to cut the wire to a length that I know is long enough to get me where I need to go later on. I'm not too worried about the exact length at this point in time. And then I'm just going to repeat the process. I need to do 4 of these.
Okay, so we'll let Rick just go ahead and do the same thing, and we'll come and wire this thing.
Okay, so you can see I've got all 4 wires tucked up underneath here, and I kind of brought them together to a point here. And so far I've run one of the wires down and attached it to the top of the cap up here. I can rearrange these a little bit later on in terms of getting them to lay a little bit more naturally. But right now I'm mostly concerned of getting a good attachment point up here and a good attachment point here with roughly the proper length in between. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this next wire, and you want to use a wire that's somewhat soft so you can do this without really having to tweak on things too much. I'm going to let that one be okay. A little bit of glue there, and a little bit of accelerator, and it's attached. And we'll continue to do that with all of these. But right now this is good enough to keep moving on to the next step. Well, we're going to do just a little bit more of this wiring here, basically some plumbing over on this side here. In this case I have some wire. I've already put a little kink in it just to kind of simulate what I want it to look like, but I'm going to test fit it in here to see if it really does what I want it to do. Starts, well, get it in there. Something like that. It just kind of loops around from down there someplace around the back. So that looks okay to me. Okay, so we've got that little pipe in there. I've kind of bunched up some of these wires a little bit better, but they're still going to get banged around, so I'm not going to worry about it too much still yet. But looking ahead, I can tell that the rest of our plumbing, a lot of the new wiring that we have to do is going to have to be incorporated with the chassis. So this is that part that we had worked on earlier. So now it's time to start integrating all these different elements into the one model. So again, we're working with plastic and resin this time, so the common glue we must use is going to be the super glue or the cyanoacrylate. Got some support blocks back in here that are resting nicely on the support blocks from the styrene kit. On the bottom, everything's all lined up nicely. Up in this area right through here, there's some electrical and some tubes that will come out of here that go into what will soon be our radiator, which is out front here. So I'm going to go ahead and add those in right now. And we can use all sorts of different types of materials to do wiring and plumbing. In this case, I've just chosen some 20 thousandths of the evergreen plastic strip. And super easy to work with. I'm just going to stick it through that hole. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of that CA glue on the end here. Oops. Kind of like we did before, just get enough on there so I can find something hard to hit it on. You want to make the illusion that something's really going on down there. They're not an expert. They're not going to know if the pipe is not exactly the right size or connecting to perfectly the right place, but if it's busy, it's going to be convincing.
Right.
So that's really the illusion we're looking for right now. We got a little more details to do, but we're getting close. One last step we'll do on the engine before we really start working back on the tractor itself is that we've got a radiator up here out of photo etch. We'll go ahead and cut that out, and then that gets installed right here on the front. So let me do that. And again, we're just snapping down on those little attachment points. I'll add a little dab of glue onto the post and a little more glue because I want to make sure I've got a good contact there. And then the radiator. Okay, so sure enough, we have to make a bend here, and what's going to happen? The reason for that is we're going to make little walls. Basically, going to slide down inside of these four corners here for attachment points. Okay, so I've got my little four walls bent on this thing, and now it should just drop right in there. And there it goes. So what I'll do now is just glue around the corners to keep that in place. Okay. But even at this stage,
just compare to the original.
This is the original piece, so you can definitely see how we have more depth and detail, and the definition of that grill is going to be fabulous because we'll be able to see through the grill literally than just try to simulate the grill on the front as we've done now. So I think this is a major improvement. This is one of those times when you think to yourself, should I go ahead and make this improvement or not, like we did earlier with that photo etch. This is definitely one of those times that the photo etch and the new resin piece make a big difference in the finished product. I went ahead and I've installed the radiator onto the chassis here. So the next step is we're going to start working on those large drive wheels. So we'll just start up here at the top, and again we're going to be doing a situation where we don't want to glue certain parts of it because we want them to stay workable. And we'll do the same thing on the other side.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're ready to attach these big wheel housings onto this thing. Again, we flipped it over, and looking at the directions here for basically our guidance. Let's move this up like this. You can see we've got a couple of connection points that we need to be mindful of. But it's fairly straightforward once you see it.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll let Rick just go ahead and put the other one on. We'll be right back.
Okay, so now we're going to proceed to the next part of our project, which is really the customizing part that gives this particular project its uniqueness. As we've talked about before, this project was based on a reference photograph, a period photograph taken during World War II, showing this particular tractor, probably a one-off conversion used for some purpose. So we have to figure out a way to make it ourselves. And it's actually quite simple. The basic tools for this trade, scratch building that is plastics. And evergreen is a great source of lots of small pieces of plastic that come in various shapes and sizes. They're already pre-cut, they're pre-sized, I should say, and then you just simply cut them, glue them together to get the various shapes that you want. So along with the strip pieces of plastic, which come in different shapes and sizes, another part of the plastic world that we need to look at is sheet plastic, and these come in various thicknesses. This is about a 030 right here, a little thicker. This is about a 010 right here, very thin, almost paper thin. And these come in all sorts of different thicknesses. And finally, one last piece that we might want to consider, this is called a chopper. Simple idea, you got a hinge here, a razor blade here, and you cut down and chop it, and I use a little piece of plastic with double-sided tape as my stop. Basically, you run your plastic inside here to the desired length, chop it down, you get a perfect cut, nice and crisp. So that's an important tool. Not necessary, but it makes life easier, especially if you're replicating cuts over and over again of a specific size. So now we'll go ahead and get started on the project. So let's get started here, and I guess probably one of the first things we should really kind of discuss is kind of the elephant in the room here is really how do you get started? Where do you make your first cut, and how do you know what to do first? Since this is based off a photograph, and I have a single photograph, no angles, no plans, just the one photograph, I have to make some assumptions. I know from the photograph that the two booms coming out the front that hold the front wheels start here, and they start here, and they protrude forward to a point out here in some distance. I don't know exactly what this distance is, but I can figure out what the distance is between here and here. And I'm simply going to take my calipers and measure this distance here. Now I want to keep that real quick, so I'm just going to lock down this little nut here. Now this doesn't want to slide, and I've got this distance. So the next thing I'm going to do, I could use that chopper we talked about earlier, but since I'm just making a single cut, I'm just going to make a single cut. And I'm going to use the calipers as my straight edge here. So it's locked, so it's not going to slide. Put my blade right against it and just simply kind of rock it back and forth and make my cut. Since it's an angle iron, it's not as quite as easy as a flat piece, but there I go. That's my first cut. So one of the things I'm going to do is look at the photograph and kind of get an idea, does this thing extend twice as much as the original vehicle? You know, if you were to set it back this way, does it extend half as much? If I kind of do some visual comparison. Well, I'm looking at this thing and I'm thinking, well, about 3 inches, 3.5 inches out in perspective looks about right. And I'm just simply going to run my pencil down like this. Now I know that I've got 3.5 inches to this point right here. So now we know that this area in here is the shape of our boom. So now it's very simple. We're just going to cut this out using our straight edge. You want to make your longer cuts first, just to cut the piece away from the plastic. Right. And here it's baby steps. You don't want to do it all in the first pass. You're just scoring it, scoring it, scoring it 2 or 3 times until it starts to break through. So we know that this is going to attach here somehow. It's going to have a gap, span across there, where another one, the mirror image of this one's going to be. But that looks about right. Okay, so we've got our 2 pieces here, and I've applied a piece of double-sided tape on the one. And now we're simply going to mate these together. We know that the bottom on one of them is a little bit bigger than, a little wider than the other one, but we know the tops are going to be the same, so we're going to match these along the top. So we just turn them upside down. Get the length should be fairly close, and you just squeeze the double-sided tape together, and we're ready to go. So we're going to go, so now we have two. You can see there's a little bit of difference in the size right there, so we're going to take care of that right now. So what we're going to do is grab our sanding sticks over here, and we're simply going to make sure these are tight, pinch them together, and start sanding. Notice the direction I'm sanding. I want this, I don't want to go this way because I don't want it to divot out. I want the lengthwise to be the same, so I'm going lengthwise with these. And we'll simply just even these out. And you can see that that's coming along just fine. So there we go. So now we have two sides. They're equal in size and shape, and we simply can just pull these apart and get started on the next step. But styrene in and of itself, you can see it's got a lot of flex. It's got a lot of flex to it, and you can use that to your advantage. If you need a curved piece, if you're in your scratch building, you can bend these around and get a shape. And if you go into a little bit more scratch building, you want to keep this shape, you can double side this around, say a round object, hit it with a little heat from a hairdryer, and it changes the molecular configuration of your styrene and will hold this new shape. Neat little trick.